Do you think men are more violent than women? Inside some of the world's most notorious women's prisons, that question doesn't really matter, because once those cell doors close, humanity seems to disappear. From the United States to Russia, from Mexico to North Korea, these prisons share one terrifying thing in common: mercy doesn't exist. Today, we're taking a look inside some of the most dangerous women's prisons on Earth, places where guards don't always kill their victims. They simply make them wish they were dead. Everything you're about to hear is based on real accounts, real investigations, and real survivors. And some of these stories are almost impossible to believe. Let's begin with the United States. When people think about American prisons, they usually imagine a system built around law and order. But behind the walls of some women's prisons, a very different reality exists. According to reports, a large percentage of incarcerated women have experienced physical or sexual abuse during their lives, and for some, prison only adds another layer of suffering. Take the case of Cheryl Weir. Her life changed forever over something as simple as a complaint. She reportedly told staff she was unable to clean a toilet. What happened next would leave her permanently disabled. According to allegations, several guards forced her to the ground, dragged her across concrete, and assaulted her so severely that her neck was broken. Today, she lives paralyzed from the neck down and depends on a ventilator to survive. And unfortunately, her story isn't unique. Another inmate, Latrina Rollington, was only 7 months away from freedom when she was found dead in solitary confinement. Officials initially claimed she died from natural causes, but her family wasn't convinced. Just days before her death, she had sent a disturbing letter describing threats from a correctional officer. A private autopsy later suggested a very different story. Instead of a heart condition, investigators found evidence of severe internal injuries and extensive bruising. Fellow inmates claimed she had witnessed misconduct and tried to speak up. If true, that decision may have cost her life. Inside these facilities, many former inmates describe a culture of silence, a world where reporting abuse can make you a target, and where survival often means keeping your head down and saying nothing. Now let's move to a country where even hardened criminals fear being sent behind bars: Russia. Inside Russia's prison system are facilities known as correctional colonies. On paper, they're supposed to rehabilitate inmates, but according to former prisoners and human rights organizations, some of these places have become symbols of fear, violence, and suffering. One former inmate, Tatiana Gabova, spent years inside one of these colonies. She was sentenced to 16 years in prison. But according to her, the sentence itself wasn't the worst part. The real punishment was surviving each day inside the prison walls. Former inmates describe a system where violence becomes routine, where complaints disappear before anyone reads them, and where speaking up often makes life even worse. Gabova repeatedly tried to report abuse and mistreatment. She wrote letters. She filed complaints. She begged for help, but nothing changed. Instead, she claimed she faced punishment after punishment, isolation, intimidation, and constant pressure to confess to things she never did. Eventually, something happened that shows just how desperate life inside these prisons can become. After another inmate died, Gabova reportedly confessed to a crime she hadn't committed. Not because she was guilty, but because she hoped being transferred to another facility might save her from the nightmare she was already living through. Imagine that. Confessing to a crime you didn't commit because prison feels safer than the place you're already trapped in. But the transfer didn't bring freedom. It only led to another colony with its own horrifying reputation. Former inmates describe prison hospitals where people entered sick and left completely broken. Places where heavy medication, isolation, and psychological pressure slowly erased a person's sense of self. According to survivors, some prisoners became so traumatized that they struggled to remember basic tasks. Even holding a spoon became difficult. Eventually, Gabova's letters reached members of a human rights commission. When investigators finally saw her condition, they reportedly found a woman physically and mentally devastated by years of abuse. And her story is only one among many. Critics of the system argue that when accountability disappears, abuse becomes easy, and when nobody fears consequences, prisoners can become completely powerless. For many former inmates, Russia's correctional colonies aren't places of rehabilitation. They're places where hope slowly dies. Next, we're heading to Mexico, a prison so violent that many people compare it to a war zone. La Mesa prison sits near the US-Mexico border and has become infamous for overcrowding, gang violence, and deadly riots. For years, thousands of inmates were packed into a facility built for only a fraction of that number. When a prison designed for less than 2,000 people suddenly holds more than 6,000, disaster becomes almost inevitable. But it wasn't always known for violence. Decades ago, La Mesa was famous for a very different reason. Legendary Mexican singer Chelino Sanchez was once imprisoned there before becoming one of the most influential figures in regional Mexican music. Some people even say his musical journey began behind those prison walls. Today, however, the sounds of music have been replaced by something much darker. Gunshots, screams, and the chaos of riots. Over the years, large portions of the prison have been destroyed during violent uprisings. Dozens of inmates have lost their lives, and many more have been seriously injured. One of the deadliest incidents began during what should have been a routine prison inspection. Authorities discovered drugs and mobile phones inside a prisoner's cell. The inmate resisted. The confrontation escalated, and before long, the prisoner was dead. What happened next pushed the prison into complete chaos. Other inmates believed justice would never be served, so they took matters into their own hands. A massive riot erupted. For 12 straight hours, violence spread throughout the facility. Buildings burned. Prisoners fought, and multiple people lost their lives. According to reports, some inmates were beaten so severely that their bodies were later thrown into fires started during the unrest. But the worst was still to come. Just 3 days later, female prisoners climbed onto rooftops and began shouting for help. This wasn't simply a protest. They claimed they had been denied basic necessities, including food, clean water, and proper medical care. Desperation quickly turned into confrontation. Prisoners began throwing rocks at guards. Families gathered outside the prison walls, refusing to leave. Tensions exploded. Eventually, security forces opened fire. What followed remains highly controversial. Some viewed it as an attempt to restore order. Others described it as a massacre. By the time the violence ended, more than 20 prisoners were dead. Many had been shot. Others died from injuries sustained during the clashes. Today, La Mesa remains one of the most heavily guarded prisons in the region. Armed personnel patrol its perimeter. Security measures resemble those of a military installation. Yet despite all that protection, fear continues to dominate life inside. Because in places like La Mesa, violence isn't an exception. It's part of everyday life. And now we arrive at what may be the most terrifying prison system on this list. North Korea. Before we continue, it's important to understand something. Many of the stories you're about to hear sound almost unbelievable, but they come from defectors, survivors, and human rights investigations that have spent years documenting what happens inside these camps. Officially, North Korea doesn't call many of these facilities prisons. Instead, they're often described as re-education camps. The name sounds harmless. The reality is anything but. Inside these camps, political prisoners are often held alongside murderers, kidnappers, and other criminals. A person can end up there for criticizing the government, trying to escape the country, or sometimes simply because a family member was accused of doing so. Former prisoners describe enormous compounds surrounded by electric fences, watchtowers, and armed guards. Once inside, escape is nearly impossible. But what makes these camps truly horrifying is the way prisoners are treated. According to survivor testimonies, guards routinely tell inmates that they are no longer human beings, that they are animals, and that their lives have no value. The goal is simple: break the prisoner completely. Many survivors say the suffering begins with forced labor. Every day starts before sunrise. Prisoners work from early morning until late at night. Little food, little rest, and almost no medical care. Some former inmates describe working 18 to 20 hours a day under constant supervision. Anyone who falls behind risks severe punishment. Anyone who complains risks even worse. Over time, hunger becomes one of the greatest enemies. Food is so scarce that prisoners search for anything they can eat. Rats, snakes, insects, anything that might keep them alive for another day. Some survivors describe digging through animal waste, looking for undigested grains of corn. As horrifying as that sounds, many say starvation left them with no choice. For pregnant women, conditions can be even more devastating. Multiple testimonies claim that pregnancies are often treated as a problem to be eliminated rather than protected. Families are torn apart, children disappear, and countless stories end in tragedy. But perhaps the most disturbing part of life inside these camps is the public punishment. Executions are not always hidden from other prisoners. Instead, they can become public spectacles. Survivors describe being forced to watch as inmates are beaten, shot, or executed in front of large crowds. The purpose is fear, a warning to everyone else. Obey the rules, never question authority, and never attempt to escape, because the consequences could be fatal. In some camps, former prisoners say that even the smallest mistake can bring brutal punishment. Walking into a restricted area, speaking without permission, failing to meet work quotas. Any of these could trigger severe consequences. For many inmates, death is not the greatest fear. The greatest fear is surviving. Surviving another day of hunger, another day of labor, another day of watching others suffer, and another day knowing that nobody on the outside may ever learn what happened to them. For decades, reports from these camps have painted a picture of a system built on fear, control, and absolute power, a place where hope becomes rare, and where freedom feels almost impossible to imagine. When most people think about prison, they imagine locked doors, concrete walls, and the loss of freedom. But the stories we've explored today reveal something much darker. From allegations of abuse inside American prisons, to the brutal realities described by former inmates in Russia, to the deadly riots of Mexico's overcrowded facilities, and finally, to the horrifying accounts emerging from North Korea's prison camps, one thing becomes painfully clear. The prison sentence is not always the worst punishment. Sometimes the real punishment is what happens after the cell door closes. It's easy to forget that behind every prison number is a human being, a person with a story, a family, a past, and sometimes a future that is slowly taken away. Not every story can be verified. Not every accusation has been proven. But the sheer number of testimonies, investigations, and survivor accounts raises questions that cannot simply be ignored. Questions about power, questions about justice, and questions about what happens when nobody is watching. Because history has shown us something important. The greatest abuses often happen in places hidden from public view, places where silence becomes protection, and where fear becomes a weapon. The prisons we've discussed today represent only a small glimpse into a much larger reality, a reality that continues to affect thousands of women around the world every single day. And perhaps the most disturbing part of all is knowing that many of these stories are not from the distant past. They're happening right now. If you found this video informative, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. And let me know in the comments which prison shocked you the most. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.